Welcome everyone to the Bodybuilding Dietitians Podcast. You're joined for another episode by myself and Lauren today, and we're going to be talking all about fiber and how it may relate to overarching health, but also specifically for body composition as well and lifters, and how to navigate fiber optimally while also training and ticking off all the other sort of nutritional boxes as well. So I think first, like a very appropriate place to start is like what fiber is and from a broad perspective, why it's important, what are the different types of fiber. And I think it really is, in my opinion, the most underrated nutrient, because I think people look at fiber in such a singular fashion and they think maybe similar to how people may view other macronutrients like carbs, like there's only carbohydrates help with one thing and that may be this, whereas dietary fiber, for many people, I think people still see it as, oh, that's the thing that helps with my digestion. Whereas it's much broader than that, especially with more and more emerging research on the microbiome and how influential the microbiome is on our overarching health, not just physical health, but even sort of mental health and how it links to the gut-brain axes and all these other variables. So yeah, Lauren, I'll throw this sort of initial question to you, which we can go back and forth on, but like kind of what is fiber or like what are the different types as well?
Yeah, so I love to use this analogy with clients, and I say that fiber is kind of like the Clark Kent of nutrition. It looks boring and understated, not very flashy and not very exciting, but most people just think, oh yeah, fiber helps you poo. But then when you actually look at what fiber does, appetite, cholesterol, gut microbiome, bowel, cardiovascular disease risk, etc., which I'm sure we'll touch on, it's actually Superman in a pair of glasses. And fiber is a carbohydrate, but it's not digested and absorbed the same way as sugars and starches, for example. And it largely resists digestion in the small intestine and reaches the large bowel, where some types can be fermented by gut bacteria. So I like to think about fibers as, well, we'll categorize them by what they do. And briefly touching on the types of fiber. So we have soluble fiber, which dissolves in water and can form like a gel-like substance in the gut. So this is the one reason it can help with cholesterol lowering and blood glucose regulation, slower digestion, appetite control, etc. Very common sources are like oats and barley and legumes and psyllium and apples and things like that. So soluble fiber is the one I often think of as the slow things down fiber. So it can slow gastric emptying and all that sort of thing, which we might touch on a little bit more when we talk about appetite. And then we have insoluble fiber, which doesn't dissolve in water the same way. It adds bulk to the stool and basically helps with bowel regularity. So it's often found in whole grains, wheat, bread, nuts, seeds, vegetable skins, and then many other types of fibrous vegetables. So insoluble fiber, think of it more like the broom of the gut. So it basically helps to add the bulk and keep things moving. And then we have what we call fermentable fiber or prebiotic fiber. So some fibers are fermented by gut bacteria and can help produce what we call short chain fatty acids, which people might have heard of before. And they include things like cetate, propionate, and also butyrate as well. So butyrate is particularly important because it's a major fuel source for colon cells and is linked with gut barrier and immune and metabolic health. So food examples are like legumes, oats, onion, garlic, asparagus, like slightly green bananas, cooked and cooled potatoes, rice, things like that. And then we have resistant starch, and it behaves like fiber because it resists digestion in the small intestine and is fermented in the large bowel. So this is often found in legumes, again, green bananas, oats, etc. So this is basically a great example of why carbs aren't automatically bad. So people think, oh, carbs are bad. I'm like, but they contain all these nutrients and different types of fibers and things like that. So yeah, that would be my broad overview of different types.
Yeah, awesome. I really don't have too much to add there. I think important for people to recognize that there are types which essentially do different roles. So like I would reinforce from that, again, having a variety of different fiber types. So that way you accomplish some of the benefits of soluble, because you have something that is soluble, but then more fermentable, but soluble and less fermentable, and then vice versa with insoluble as well. although typically it's the soluble fiber that will more often be more fermentable than insoluble fiber. So, yeah, I think that's a really, really good start. And I think maybe we can start talking a little bit more in depth about some of the benefits of fiber and how these happen before we get into kind of more practical points around how to reach a good fiber intake. So like there is some really interesting sort of systematic reviews and meta-analyses around with very, very large populations now. Like in the Lancet in 2019, there was kind of a series of systematic reviews and meta-analyses which reached 135 million people, and essentially like a 15 to 30% decrease in all-cause mortality and a variety of different sort of comorbidities as well, like cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes as well, colorectal cancer, when comparing sort of the highest fiber consumers to the lowest fiber. And they did find somewhat of a dose-dependent effect. So like essentially the more fiber you ate, the more benefits you would receive up until a certain point. And outcomes were usually greatest when fiber was around sort of 25 to 29 grams per day. So it's not a crazy amount of fiber. I think maybe when some people think of, I need to, in order to reach the benefits of fiber intake, I maybe need to be 50, 60, 70 grams a day. And at this stage, the largest return on investment for fiber isn't saying that you need to be really anywhere near that point. What would you add to that, Lauren?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about cardiovascular health as well. When we talk about our heart health, a lot of people jump straight to saturated fat, cholesterol, or sodium, but fiber is one of the most underrated cardiovascular nutrition tools that we have, especially viscous types of soluble fiber. So things like oats, barley, and psyllium, for example. So as you just sort of alluded to then, higher dietary fiber and whole grain intake is associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and colorectal cancer as well in major systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And essentially, one of the key mechanisms is cholesterol lowering, again, particularly with the viscous soluble types like oats and barley, etc. So these types can form basically like a bit of a gel-like substance in the gut, which can then essentially bind to the bile acids. And because bile acids are essentially made from cholesterol, the body then has to use more cholesterol to replace them, which can then inevitably help to lower the cholesterol. So fiber can also support blood glucose regulation by slowing digestion and carbohydrate absorption. So this can actually help reduce large post-meal glucose spikes as well, which is sort of relevant because long-term glycemic control and say insulin resistance are also linked with cardiometabolic risk as well. And there may also be some blood pressure benefits as well. So high fiber diets are often, obviously quite rich in whole grains and legumes, fruits, veggies, nuts and seeds, etc., which provide, again, potassium and magnesium and polyphenols and other compounds as well that help to support vascular health. So the gut microbiome may also play a role here. Like fermentable fibers can, again, as I mentioned before, increase short-chain fatty acid production, and these metabolites are often involved in inflammation regulation as well, like gut barrier function, metabolic health. So all of which are very may indirectly influence cardiovascular risk as well.
Yeah, it definitely is all encompassing in certain respects. Like I find that with the study that I was referencing as well, because it is more of an epidemiological study following people over years, like there is that caveat that people who maybe eat more fiber also practice other sort of beneficial lifestyle habits as well, which is a consideration. And everything that you said there around sort of cardiovascular disease and cholesterol lowering properties, like really useful. And there is a particular fiber type that you mentioned earlier, a type of soluble fiber called beta-glucans, which is one sort of type of soluble fiber in particular that's strongly associated with cholesterol lowering benefits, particularly LDL cholesterol, of course. So, and that's found most commonly in oats. So like oats, I'm sure if I had to say, probably more than 50% of the listeners right now would eat oats on a daily basis, I can imagine. So would encourage people to keep it up. But obviously there's other forms of beta-glucans as well and other forms of soluble fiber. That's just one easy win for oats. Even like I think in bodybuilding in particular, like cream of rice is another super popular sort of breakfast option. But the only downside of cream of rice is that it is so low in fiber, and it's great as like a pre-workout meal, because like if you want to prioritize digestion or prioritize a lower food volume approach, then it's great. But I've been actually, I'm not sure if you've tried this, but I've been adding oats and cream of rice together to call it, I mean, I think it's called coats or croats or something like that, but it works quite well. Have you ever been on the cream of rice train or?
No, that also sounds like a very innovative combo, but no, I haven't. I actually, no joke, had a client last night in her check-in notes was like, I'm now on the cream of rice train. So anyway, I think that's funny. But no, I've actually never really eaten it, if I'm honest. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oats, yes, cream of rice. But I think I would definitely be into it because I'm into the rice pudding type consistency thing. So maybe I'm gonna have to give it a go again.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is a bit more dense, and you can't volumize it as much as oats, in my opinion. But it's a tasty, and depending on what else you add to it, rice in and of itself is obviously pretty neutral regarding nutrition. But as we know, nutrition is not all about nutrition. So yeah, I thought we'd touch a little bit more on the microbiome. And while this episode isn't necessarily on gut health alone and the microbiome, I definitely am keen to do a full standing episode on like gut health more broadly and the microbiome more specifically. But it would be remiss not to sort of talk and expand on sort of the microbiome and short chain fatty acids. So essentially, as you alluded to earlier, like fiber, there are certain fiber types which are prebiotics, and prebiotics almost act as like the fertilizer for your gut bacteria. So prebiotics are fermented, and then it basically helps sort of allow more positive strains of gut bacteria to diversify and multiply. And I guess in a sense, like occupy space or breed out more negative or detrimental or even neutral strains of gut bacteria. So the reason why this is so beneficial is because there is more and more emerging literature that these kind of positively fermented strains of gut bacteria are associated with short chain fatty acids. There is one in particular called butyrate, which is like the hero of short chain fatty acids, and that's butyrate. So arguably the most important for gut health specifically. I think you mentioned colonocytes as well, which is essentially like the cells lining the colon, and butyrate is a primary sort of energy source for these colonocytes, but also helping with, the gut barrier. Anti-inflammatory properties are another major one as well. And essentially like having a well-fed gut microbiome through these prebiotics is going to help with all of those sort of downstream effects. Like another interesting statistic is around 70% of our immune cells are in the gut too. So, and the gut has its own nervous system called the enteric nervous system. So I think it reinforces that it's such an integral aspect of our physiology. And I think more and more people are looking at if someone is getting sick all the time, or there are signs and symptoms that they have a poorer immune system. Like, again, we're looking more and more at the gut these days rather than something external. And unfortunately, like it is pretty clear with just statistics around fruit and vegetable intake and fiber intake that although sort of 25 to 30 grams of fiber on paper and in theory is a very achievable amount to get, people just aren't meeting those thresholds where there are some very easy wins for people to capitalize on these benefits. And I think often understandably as well, like people are put off by some of the negative digestive symptoms around fiber as well. Like if someone does try and have more fiber, they may get a poorer digestion initially, which is something that we're going to talk about more today as well. So I think before we get to that, like maybe we can talk a bit more specifically for lifters around like appetite, satiety, and body composition. And I'll let you talk a bit more about some of the mechanisms there, like gastric emptying. But I think before we get to that, I want to talk about sort of staggering fiber throughout the day. And I think one of the big thing for lifters and athletes and people who exercise regularly is combining fiber with also your training window as well. I think if you're training once a day, the speed of absorption of your pre or post workout meal is less important depending on how well fueled you are. So if you're training later in the day and you have a pre-workout meal that is still a couple hours away from your training session, then you probably don't have to worry as much about the amount of fiber in your meal. Like if you're having a moderate to higher fiber meal, obviously there's always going to be individuality around how you digest that meal and how comfortable it is for you. I think if you are less fueled, so if it's earlier in the day and you're eating within a closer time frame to your session, that's when you probably do want fiber lower. Like maybe again, tolerability of the individual is everything. Like for me, for example, like a low fiber meal would be 10 grams, and I could tolerate that perfectly fine, like an hour before or within an hour of training. But for someone else, it might provide negative ramifications to digestibility and your comfortability during the session. So, and that's something that we audit regularly for clients, like particularly when we first receive clients or we have a consultation with them, or we always have a consultation before our weekly coaching as well. We don't really we try not to have like a questionnaire or just a once-off form that people do. In fact, we never really do that upon only very specific situations. Like we always have an initial consultation with a client before they proceed into weekly coaching, which is an opportunity for us to learn more about the individual and how we can help best. And Fibre is often one of those that we look at from a health optimization standpoint, but also a training standpoint as well. And it's often one area that people struggle with a little bit is managing their fiber around the context of training. But I guess talking a bit more specifically about appetite and satiety, what would be some points you'd mention there?
Yeah. So when it comes to appetite and essentially body composition, we know that higher fiber foods are usually more filling because it goes without saying they add more volume, they slow digestion, and they often require more chewing as well. So I believe that clinical trial data in quite large systematic reviews has found that higher fiber intake is often associated with lower body weight and lower solid blood pressure, lower total cholesterol when compared with lower fiber intakes, as we sort of touched on in terms of the cardiovascular risk before. But there are a few ways fiber can actually help with appetite a little bit more specifically. So firstly, the higher fiber foods tend to increase meal volume without adding a huge amount of calories. So for example, adding berries or chia or oats to yogurt, or vegetables, salad or legumes to lunch, or adding beans, lentils or extra veggies to dinner. Secondly, viscous soluble fiber types, as we've touched on before, can slow gastric emptying, which can help someone feel a lot fuller for longer. And then thirdly, the fermentable fibers can be fermented by gut bacteria into short chain, as we mentioned before, which may influence appetite regulated hormones like GLP-1 and PYY. And it's actually probably interesting to very briefly touch on the natural GLP-1 because it's just absolutely rampant at the moment with the use of the GLP-1 agonists. So the GLP-1, essentially, for people who aren't aware of it, is a hormone we naturally produce in the gut already, and it helps with satiety, glucose regulation, and slowing gastric emptying. So certain nutrients, particularly, it's not just fiber, it's not just protein, but it's the combination of protein, fiber, and fats that can help to stimulate satiety hormones like GLP-1, PYY, and CCK, I believe, as well. But the effect from food is physiological and much smaller than what we would see in a GLP-1 agonist. So try to emulate the very, very powerful satiety effect of a GLP-1 agonist through food is not really going to happen per se. But you can definitely try to optimize it as much as possible with the composition of the amount of protein, carbs, and fats that you have. So yeah, we shouldn't talk about food like it has the same strength as that particular drug. I would say a little bit off topic of fiber very briefly, but protein is probably the most consistently satiating macro, as we know. Higher protein meals can increase satiety, again, like GLP-1 and the PYY, etc., as I just mentioned. This is one reason why a high protein and a high fiber meal together is usually far more filling than a low protein, low fiber meal with the same type of calories, for example. But also, fats can also contribute to satiety by, again, slowing gastric emptying and stimulating those hormones as well. But unfortunately, they can be quite calorie dense. So fat can help a meal feel very satisfying, but adding a lot of fat can quickly obviously increase those calories as well. So you need to be mindful of that. And that's why the goal is usually not like low fat or high fat, but enough fat to make those meals a little bit more satisfying as well, while still, fitting into the person's overall calorie target. So I think from a practical appetite perspective, like a really useful structure is like protein in each meal, high fiber carbohydrates or vegetables for volume, and some type of dietary fats for satisfaction as well. So that could be, Greek yogurt with berries and chia, or eggs on whole grain toast with some avocado, or chicken with potatoes and veggies, or oats with whey and berries and things like that. So we want to be thinking about the combination of those macros to optimize satiety.
Yeah, certainly. I think it's one of the biggest aspects that again we'd audit with someone if someone is having a meal and then they're hungry quite soon afterwards. Like looking at fiber in that context is super important. Delaying gastric emptying, helping with stretch reflex of the stomach, and I think it is. I love that you drew the point of the GLP-1 as well because like it's obviously super. It's the buzzword these days, but it's where these medications are drawing from is what fiber naturally does already in terms of stimulating some of these peptides. But obviously medication is just, going to super physiological doses of that.
Mm.
So I think the other context of body composition as well is, of course, like helping with appetite management. And that obviously goes both ways in like a deficit and a surplus. Like that's where, again, modulation is key and individuality is key, where in a surplus, someone might need to be strategic in a different way with fiber where they still need to get in sufficient fiber. We don't want our fiber intake to suddenly go down the drain just because we're struggling with appetite. We want to make sure that we're still getting in sufficient fiber at certain points of the day to still reach our daily quota. And what that could look like, for example, in a deficit, Lauren basically already covered that with being strategic with dietary fat and protein as well. And I think in a deficit, it's often even a little bit easier because like you can just have fiber at each meal and cover your bases there to also help with satiation. But when you're in a surplus, like if you're getting incredibly satiated and you're struggling to finish your meal, then prioritizing a lower food volume and potentially lower fiber, but then also capitalizing on times where you do maybe have a slightly higher appetite. And I often find that that's potentially after training where people have a little bit more room to consume fiber containing foods, even if it does mean a slightly higher fiber meal post training, which again, if in the context of them just training once a day, like I think that's still entirely appropriate. Because otherwise, if people just go off purely appetite and hunger in a surplus phase and they're struggling to eat enough, then they may be prioritizing those lower fiber sources and they may be ending up at 15, 20 grams of fiber a day. I think we can start getting into some limitations here because so far, like we've painted a scene of like fiber being Clark Kent and being something that is all upsides with no downsides when that isn't the case. Like I think I would probably split these limitations into two different camps. Like limitation one being things that people that are like within the context of the individual versus like just innate circumstances of fiber properties itself. Like, so what that means is if someone has too much fiber, like potentially like too much too quickly, then, and this is often where people struggle when they do ramp up their fiber and they go from like having 10 grams a day to 30, is that your body will struggle a little bit with tolerating that much indigestible carbohydrate. So you will suddenly get more fermentation, particularly if you're consuming certain types of fiber, again, the more fermentable types, and that will cause a bit more gas and bloating and flatulence, and you'll feel that abdominal discomfort as well. So I think the key thing there is like increase it gradually, like increase it by like 5 grams a week up until you reach your sort of goal point. I'll let you sort of, we'll kind of maybe alternate between a few different ones here.
Yeah, that's a really good point about titrating fiber. Like, even though we know the recommendations are, what is it like? Is it 10 or 11 or 11 to 12 grams per 1,000 calories or something? Or roughly?
Roughly, yeah.
Yeah, 20, 25 for women, maybe 30 for men. Again, it could be a little bit higher, of course. But you mentioned the too much too soon, so I won't really elaborate too much on that. But yeah, if someone says like, oh, fiber doesn't agree with me, sometimes it's not the fiber itself, it's the dose, it's the type, it's how quickly that they increase it. So if I do a little bit of an audit on a client's intake and their fiber is like 5 to 10 grams, like I'm not just going to make them increase suddenly to 30 grams because as you said, it does increase the risk of gas. So slowly titrating it up over the course of weeks is beneficial. But also I have seen a few clients over the past, like come to me and say, well, I take fiber supplements, I take psyllium husk, and I'm fine. And I'm like, well, psyllium can be very useful as I've mentioned before, but it's not a replacement for a very plant-rich diet. So psyllium is probably one of the best examples here, because people think, oh, I take psyllium husk and it's fine. So yes, it can be helpful for constipation, for example, because it helps to hold water in the stool and improves stool consistency. But the point I make is that psyllium is just one type of fiber. It can help you hit your fiber target, but it doesn't give you the same diversity that you can normally get. But additionally to that is hydration and your fluid intake. When we increase fiber, we also need to think about fluid, especially if someone is constipated. So if you're adding psyllium, eating a lot of bran or high fiber products, dieting on lower calories as well, which can compound the issue, or training hard, all those types of things, we need to think, are we adequately hydrated? Whether it's 30 to 35 meals per kilogram of body weight or whatever it is, depending on your total body weight, your sweat rate, etc. But if you're with psyllium specifically, I would definitely advise to take it with a glass of water, maybe at least 250 mils, because it absorbs fluid and essentially forms a gel. So that's part of why it can actually help with stool consistency. But without adding enough fluid or ensuring that you're adequately hydrated, it actually make bloating or constipation worse. So yes, titrating fiber depending on where your current baseline is, but also thinking, are we adequately hydrated as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think another point that I'd add to limitations would be around mineral absorption and other nutrients. This is more of a concern when you are getting up there in fiber intake, and particularly if maybe someone is having an unnecessary amount of a fiber supplement, or if what's pretty common in people who are undergoing diets as well, I would say more particularly in bodybuilding, is they may have like 50% oats and then 50% oat bran, or they add in psyllium husk to their meals, or they add in some of these other higher fiber products that have added inulin and other different brands and fibers. And just got to be conscious of that in the long term. Like, make sure that you are getting your blood work done to look at some of these nutrients that are impeded by fiber. And again, more of a concern if you're having, it's difficult to quote a number because there's no research on this specifically, but I would say if you're like getting into more so grams per calorie of like 15 to 20 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories, then I would just be conscious of that in terms of calcium and iron and other sort of vitamins and minerals too. So a big one is also, which we could easily do a whole episode on, and maybe we will, but IBS and FODMAP. And so IBS is like essentially irritable bowel syndrome, not to be confused with IBD, which is inflammatory bowel disease. And IBS is more broad, like almost an umbrella term, like it encompasses so many different things that could be related specifically to a type of carbohydrate or a type of fiber that someone is consuming, or it could be something that's solely stress related and purely be psychosomatic, which is then having an influence on how we're digesting and absorbing things and our gut comfortability. So, and like, there are certain situations where FODMAP fibers and FODMAP essentially stands for fermentable oligodimonosaccharides and polyols. So essentially different sort of fermentable carbohydrate types, which for certain individuals can provide discomfort because they're fermented and they're indigestible, which produces gas and can cause constipation, etc. So we may do a whole nother episode on that, but I feel like that is what a lot of people do push back on very understandably with trying to have more fiber. Is they say, hey, I'm trying to eat more fiber and I'm going slowly, but like whenever I touch this food, like I just blow up and it's super uncomfortable. So I'm sure you've had that experience with some clients.
Yeah, I would just simply say, for gut sensitive clients particularly, we don't just say eat more fiber and just throw beans and onions and bran at them. We choose fibers that they can actually tolerate. So again, that's part of our consultation screening is, do you have any issues with, sensitivities to FODMAPs, IBS, things like that. So.
Yeah, I think, and something that I probably didn't elaborate on enough is sort of, I think each of us on the team have a different approach at how we might audit something like fiber. And don't get me wrong, it's not like someone heads into a consult with us and it's like, okay, we talk about fiber straight away. It's like one.
How much do you hoop?
Yeah, obviously solely depends on what their goals are and where they're coming from. But I would say we may not even address it in the first consultation, but it obviously is something that we look at and assess as part of their diet as a whole, which may come as part of later check-ins when we address all these different nutritional components. But I think, yeah, more broadly, we would look at the diet, sort of take away from that what their fiber intake might be, what then may be struggling with in terms of increasing fiber, or whether it was even on their radar to begin with. And then from there, we would obviously tinker with certain things around their comfortability with digestion, their tolerability of certain fiber types as well, and also around training too, depending on when they train, what type of activity it is, what they're used to doing, etc. So, and every now and then, it comes to a situation where we even pull down fiber, which happens every now and again as well. If people are having too much fiber and then into a position where it's hindering their overarching calorie intake or fueling appropriately, and just general comfortability too. So, which happens every now and then. So I wanted to touch on one more aspect around body composition too, because often, as we alluded to with body composition, like, yes, it can help in a fat loss phase, but due to the interaction between fiber and the microbiome, we also have to remember that, okay, if feeding my microbiome and creating a more diverse microbiome helps with reducing inflammation, if I have lower sort of systemic inflammation, can I recover better? Can I perform better in the gym? And can I adapt to training more efficiently? And also, if my immune system is better due to all the immune cells located in the gut, am I able to get sick less often and not have to take as much time away from training? And I think more systemically, it's quite beneficial in that respect, which is, yes, it's quite indirect. It's not quite the same as you head into the gym and progressively overload, but it's all of these different puzzle pieces which sort of create the bigger picture of progression for an individual and body composition change. So maybe we could switch into some sort of practical application of fiber time and time again. Like, I probably have been asked this question like a million times, but like, yeah, what can I eat to reach my fiber intake? And I'm struggling to hit my 25 to 30 grams per day. And what would you sort of say initially in terms of sources or things like that?
I would generally say to people, start with the easiest wins. You don't have to overhaul. Think about, having a look at what you're eating across the day and seeing how low your fiber is in those certain meals. Are we only getting 1 to 2 grams at this meal? Can we up it to 3 to 5 grams? Can we add a little bit more fiber of the existing fiber types that you're already having? Maybe you could just increase the amount of berries that you're having, for example. But I would essentially add one fiber anchor to each meal. So examples again might be that, do you have oats with milk and honey? Could we add some chia seeds to that? Could we add some berries with that? Do you have a yogurt bowl with, some granola and banana and stuff? Like, could we add a little bit of bran? Can we add a little bit of seeds to that? Again, can we add some berries to that? Do you have, white-based pasta or refined-based sort of pastas all the time? There are some higher fiber ones out there now. Could you just make that easy swap without me telling you to eat brown rice instead of pasta all the time, do you like legumes and chickpeas? Maybe could you add them into, like a bolognese or into salads or something like that? So I think there's another concept that I use is the fiber layering idea. So instead of relying on like one massive bowl of like bran or something, layer really small amounts across the day. So similar to what I said before, like oats and berries at breakfast, or an apple with skin as a snack, or a whole grain wrap at lunchtime, or lentils mixed into dinner, as I said before. So this is often easier on digestion as well than just adding a really large amount at once, which is what we were explaining before has some negative consequences. So
Yeah, definitely. I wouldn't have too much more to add to that. Like, another interesting point, which I think if you are to ask maybe 10 people about, okay, like, what do I need to do to increase my fiber intake? Probably more than 50% would say like, eat more greens, eat more salad. But depending on what's in your salad, it's probably not the best source of fiber. A great source of nutrition in general. But the issue with a lot of salad-based vegetables is it's very high in water without much else, like lettuce, cucumber, tomato, all those different onion, even like all those different salad types. So you essentially want to just focus on more dense vegetables or just higher fiber foods in general. So some good examples of that, like legumes, as Lauren mentioned, oats, whole grains, chia seeds, often nuts and seeds are a fantastic source of fiber. Like they are, sure, they do contain a few extra calories, but particularly things like chia seeds, flax meal, awesome for fiber. And your more sort of dense vegetable options like broccoli and carrot, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, like those are higher in fiber compared to like your lettuce and tomato and onion. And then whole grains too, like so switching, white rice rice in general is a lower fiber grain. So whether you're having white rice or brown rice, it's probably not going to make a huge difference. Like I think you would opt maybe more so for things like quinoa or wholemeal pasta and other sort of wheat in general is a higher fiber option. But again, you want a diversity of different things. So
can tell clients, like, if you like orange based vegetables like carrots and like sweet potato, pumpkin, all that sort of thing. Like if you're already having vegetables at dinner, maybe look at the type of vegetables and just add an extra half cup. Like fill up half the plate. So you don't have to go out there and think about all these different types of things and buy all these random things and, hurt your brain about it. It's just like, think about what you're currently having. And if you could maybe swap it out to a higher fiber vegetable or have just more of what you're already having, that's generally a pretty easy addition someone can make initially.
Yeah, great example. And these are the things that, we help people with in regards to, because like someone being able to stick to something is so important. And often like people's instinct is to be like, oh, I need more protein or I need more fiber. Like I need to, as you said, revamp things completely, turn it upside down, have completely new meals. But if we're able to insert some fiber into a meal without changing the core structure of it, like let's say someone's having a bolognese at dinner, try some higher fiber pasta, add in half a tin of beans in there with your mince. So that way it sort of is integrated into the meal and you've suddenly added an extra 5 grams of fiber per serving. So yeah, but I think that pretty much wraps up this episode on fiber. And we'll, as always, end with something that we learned this week. So I'll kick this one off, and it was around actually neuroplasticity, and basically your brain is in a more favorable position to undergo neuroplasticity when you engage in sort of vigorous intensity exercise, which I thought was an interesting statistic around, which I don't know too much more than that. Luckily, I don't have to know too much more because it's something I learned this week. It's not something that we're about nutrition that we're educating people on, but I just thought that was interesting around, neuroplasticity. And I know that's a topic that you're interested in as well.
Yeah, it definitely is. Yeah, definitely. And I think in terms of neuroplasticity and new neurons and things forming, and it's such an interesting topic because it does form a lot of behavior change in people as well. And when people think that their brain is just hardwired to think and everything like a certain way, but it is malleable. You can form new neural connections, like depending on the goal you want to aim for and whatever, and what type of thought pattern you want to change and all that sort of thing. Like it does require some cognitive, effort and things like that, but it's very malleable and you can rewire your brain chemistry, and it's very, very fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Super. Even, I won't go on a tangent, but I'll let you go. What did you learn?
Actually, right on topic with fiber is something that I learned is that researchers are actually looking at whether colorectal cancer has actually a specific gut microbiome signature. A recent study, I think, analyzed thousands of gut microbiome profiles and found that the stool microbes can reflect the microbes that are found in colorectal tumors, which could potentially help with earlier detection in the future, which is interesting. It's obviously not a diagnostic tool yet, or that sort of thing, but it's another example, I guess, of why the gut microbiome is becoming such a big area in chronic disease risk. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, for sure. I think especially as testing for microbiome becomes cheaper, like hopefully it becomes a more accessible tool for everyone, and maybe at this point, it's definitely not like a default test to be used by GPs or anything like that, because it's just not cheap enough. But hopefully eventually it's on the same level as like a blood test where it's regularly recommended or prescribed. But there is also a interesting but unfortunate statistic around I think I maybe mentioned this on a previous episode, but I think colorectal cancer in young adults is like the only form of cancer that's actually increasing in prevalence in Australia. Like the rates of colorectal cancer decreasing in older populations, but increasing in younger. So again, reinforces the importance of fiber there at any age group. So that's everything on fiber. Thanks to everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch everyone next week for another episode.